Nina had always felt like she was different. When she was younger, she could never understand why she felt so drawn to certain people. She didn't have many friends, and the ones she did have never really understood her. As she grew older, Nina realized that she didn't just have a few crushes or fleeting infatuations like most people. She felt the need to connect with someone in a way that went beyond normal attraction. It wasn't that she wanted to be with different people. It was something inside of her, something she couldn't control. By the time she was in her early 20s, Nina had been in more sexual relationships than she could count. She didn't mean for it to happen. It was like a force inside her that led her from one person to the next. Every time she thought she had found someone who truly cared about her, things would fall apart. She would get too close, too attached, and she would go after another man whenever the urge arises and her boyfriend isn't around. All these she couldn't stop but regretted. The relationships never lasted, and Nina always felt ashamed of herself. Nina would record the sex moments and watch on her own just to get comfortable with objects, but she was never satisfied. She couldn't explain why she kept making the same mistakes. It wasn't until she went to a doctor for some unrelated issue that Nina learned about her condition. The doctor told her that she had something called compulsive sexual behavior, a rare condition that is characterized by excessive preoccupation with sex, leading to compulsive and repetitive behaviors that can negatively impact her daily life and relationships with people. It wasn't something she could simply control or wish away. She had to go through therapy and learn how to cope with her emotions in a healthier way. Her condition made her feel isolated from the rest of the world. Whenever she saw other people in happy, stable relationships, she felt a pang of jealousy. She had never been able to find that kind of peace. Every time she thought she had turned a corner, another relationship would fall apart because she couldn't hold herself for long without having sex with multiple partners, or she make use of objects, and whenever she is caught, she would be left to pick up the pieces of her broken heart. The worst part was the shame. She hated how people looked at her when they found out about her past. Some would whisper behind her back, others would avoid her altogether, and a few would even confront her, asking why she couldn't just settle down like everyone else. Nina wished she could explain, but how could she? How could she make people understand something she didn't fully understand herself? One day she realized she couldn't keep living like this. She needed a fresh start. She couldn't keep repeating the same mistakes and hurting herself and others in the process. It was time to do something about it. She decided that she would move to a new city, away from everything that reminded her of her past. She would find a place where she could start over, meet new people, and hopefully change her life. When Nina first arrived in the city, she felt both excited and nervous. It was a fresh start, yes, but it also felt like a blank page. She didn't know where to begin. She didn't have many friends, and the thought of trying to meet new people was both thrilling and terrifying. But she was determined to make it work. She took a deep breath and decided that she would take things one step at a time. In the months that followed, Nina was able to focus on herself. She started attending therapy sessions regularly, learning how to cope with her hypersexuality and forming healthier habits. She didn't think it would be easy, but she had hope. She was slowly finding peace within herself. She joined a local book club, started going to the gym, and even took up painting, something she had always wanted to try. But as much as she tried to focus on her own growth, there was always a part of her that felt the need to be with a man to cool her off the immediate sexual pleasure, but she was able to hold on, thanks for the therapy and self-discipline. And then one day she met Daniel. It wasn't anything dramatic. They met at a small cafe, just two strangers who happened to be in the same place at the same time. Nina was reading a book when Daniel, who had just moved to the city as well, sat down at the table next to hers. He smiled and struck up a conversation. At first, Nina was hesitant. She didn't want to get too close to anyone, not after everything she had been through. But there was something about Daniel that put her at ease. He wasn't like the others. He seemed patient, kind, and genuinely interested in her as a person. After that first meeting, they kept in touch. They went on walks, grabbed coffee, and spent more time together. Nina felt something growing between them, but this time it was different. She wasn't rushing into anything. Daniel wasn't pressuring her to be something she wasn't. For the first time, Nina felt like she could take things slow and build a relationship without the fear of making the same mistakes again. As their friendship deepened, Nina found herself confiding in Daniel about her past. She told him a few about her struggles with compulsive sexual behavior, the shame she had carried for so long, and how she had tried to move on. She expected him to pull away, to be scared or uncomfortable, That was the main reason she did not disclose every of her struggles with him, but he didn't. Instead, he listened with compassion and understanding. He didn't see her as broken. He saw her as someone worthy of love. After a long day at work, Daniel showed up at Nina's office to pick her up. He said, "My love, I've spoken to a sex therapist and she's ready to help. Maybe we can start going for the session if you're less busy." Nina was dumbfounded and she agreed almost immediately. She had to cancel her own session with her therapist because Daniel wasn't aware of it. For the first time in her life, Nina felt seen. He felt like she was more than just her past. Daniel wasn't perfect, but he was perfect for her. He loved her not because of who she was trying to be, but because of who she truly was. And so, Nina found herself believing in love again. She believed that there was hope for her, that she could heal, and that she could build a future with someone who would stand by her side through it all. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time she was excited to see where it would take her. With Daniel by her side, she felt like she could face whatever came next. They would spend hours talking, laughing, and sharing their dreams. Nina felt herself slowly opening up, like a flower blooming after a long, cold winter. Daniel wasn't just kind, he was steady. He had a quiet strength about him that made Nina feel safe. He didn't push her to talk about things she wasn't ready to share, but when she did, he listened without judgment. It was new for her, this idea that someone could know about her flaws and still choose to stay. As weeks turned into months, their bond deepened and Nina would not stop going for her therapy session. Nina could feel herself falling for him, but this time, it didn't feel like a whirlwind or a storm. It felt like a sunrise, gentle, steady, and full of promise. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was losing herself in someone else. Instead, she felt like she was finding pieces of herself she didn't know were missing. One evening, Daniel took Nina to a small park outside the city. The air was crisp and the leaves were starting to turn shades of orange and gold. They sat on a bench near a quiet pond, watching the ducks glide across the water. Daniel turned to her, his blue eyes soft and sincere. "Nina," he said, "I know you've been through a lot. And I know it hasn't been easy for you to trust someone again. But I want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Nina felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to believe him, but a part of her was still scared. Could she really trust someone like Daniel? What if he changed his mind once he saw all of her scars? "I'm trying," she said quietly. "It's just hard sometimes. I've made so many mistakes, Daniel. Sometimes I don't know if I deserve this. If I deserve you." Daniel reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "You deserve happiness, Nina. You deserve love. We all have things in our past we wish we could change, but that doesn't make us unworthy. It just makes us human." Tears welled up in Nina's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. For so long she had carried the weight of her past alone, but now she didn't have to. Daniel's words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, and for the first time she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could let go of the shame she had been holding on to for so long. From that moment on, their relationship grew even stronger. Nina found herself looking forward to their time together, whether it was a quiet evening at home or a spontaneous adventure in the city. Daniel had a way of making even the smallest moments feel special. He wasn't just her boyfriend, he was her best friend, her partner, her safe place. But as their love deepened, Nina knew she had to be honest with him about everything. She had told him bits and pieces of her past, but there were parts of her story she had kept hidden, which was her recording every of her sex escapades with different men. She was afraid of how he might react, afraid that the full truth might be too much for him to handle. One evening as they sat together on the couch, Nina took a deep breath. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you." Daniel turned to her, his expression calm and attentive. "I'm listening," he said. Nina took another deep breath, gathering her courage. "You know how I told you about my condition? About how it made me connect with people in ways I didn't always want to?" Daniel nodded. "Well, there's more to it than I've shared. Before I moved here, my life was messy. I hurt people. Not on purpose, but because I didn't know how to control what I was feeling. There are things I've done that I'm not proud of. Things I wish I could take back." Her voice broke and she looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm scared, Daniel. I'm scared that if you knew everything, you wouldn't want to be with me anymore." For a moment there was silence. Nina's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for his response. When she finally looked up, she saw tears in his eyes. Daniel did not allow her to finish her statement. Then he said, "Nina, your past doesn't scare me. What matters to me is the person you are today. The person who's trying to heal, to grow. That's the person I love." Nina felt a wave of emotion crash over her. She had spent so long believing that her past defined her, that it made her unlovable. But Daniel didn't see her that way. He saw her as someone worth fighting for, worth loving. In the weeks that followed, their relationship blossomed even more. Nina felt like she was finally learning how to live with little sexual compulsion, love and be loved in a healthy way thanks to Dan and her therapist. With Daniel's support, she continued her therapy and began to see herself in a new light. She wasn't just someone with a troubled past, she was someone with a future worth fighting for. Then one evening, as they were walking hand in hand through the city, Daniel stopped suddenly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Nina," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I never believed in love at first sight, but from the moment I met you, I knew you were someone special. You've shown me what it means to love with courage and strength, and I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Nina's heart soared. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, Nina felt a sense of hope she hadn't known in years. She was finally stepping into a new chapter of her life. A chapter filled with love, healing, and the promise of a brighter future. Nina had always dreamed of her wedding day. Even during her darkest moments, she had held on to the hope of finding someone who would love her unconditionally. Now, with Daniel by her side, that dream was coming true. Every detail of the day had been meticulously planned. The flowers, the music, the vows. It was going to be perfect, a celebration of their love and the fresh start they both deserved. The morning of the wedding was a whirlwind of activity. Nina's friends and family fluttered around her, helping her into her gown and fussing over her hair and makeup. She looked radiant in her dress, a simple yet elegant design that made her feel like the best version of herself. As she glanced at her reflection in the mirror, Nina felt a surge of gratitude. She had come so far, and now she was about to marry the man who had seen her at her worst and still chosen to love her. Her best friend, Grace, stood by her side. Grace had been a part of Nina's life since they were teenagers. She had been there through the highs and lows, the tears and laughter. Nina had always thought of Grace as her rock, someone she could trust no matter what. But lately she had sensed something was off. Grace had seemed distant, her smiles a little too forced, her words laced with an edge Nina couldn't quite place. Nina brushed it off as pre-wedding nerves. Surely her best friend would never betray her. The ceremony was held in a charming garden, with rows of white chairs and flower arrangements that seemed to bloom just for the occasion. As Nina walked down the aisle, her heart swelled with emotion. Daniel stood at the altar, his eyes locked on hers. He looked at her the way no one ever had, with a love so pure it felt like a lifeline. This was her moment, their moment, and nothing could ruin it. But as they stood hand in hand, ready to exchange vows, Grace stepped forward. She held a small device in her hand, her expression unreadable. Nina's stomach churned. What was Grace doing? "Before we go any further," Grace said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade, "there's something everyone needs to see." The crowd murmured in confusion as Grace pressed a button on the device. A screen lit up behind the altar, and to Nina's horror, a video began to play. It was a montage of Nina's past, the mistakes she had worked so hard to leave behind. There she was, with different men in bed having their sexual moments. In no time she was buried deep within her memory. The images were raw, unfiltered, and utterly devastating. Daniel's hand slipped from hers. She turned to him, desperate to explain, but his face was a mask of shock and hurt. Without a word, he stepped back, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Daniel, please," Nina whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't who I am anymore. You know me. You know the real me." But Daniel didn't respond. He turned and walked away, leaving Nina standing alone in front of the crowd. The whispers grew louder, the stares more piercing. Nina wanted to scream, to run, to disappear. Grace stood there, her face a mixture of triumph and something darker, regret perhaps, or guilt. But she didn't say a word as Nina's world crumbled around her. Nina turned and fled, her gown billowing behind her as she ran. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she needed to get away. The garden, once filled with love and hope, now felt like a prison. She found herself in a small empty room inside the venue. Her chest heaved as she struggled to breathe. The betrayal, the humiliation, the pain. It was too much. She sank to the floor, her head in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Nina couldn't tell. All she knew was that everything she had worked for, everything she had hoped for was gone. Daniel was gone. The life she had dreamed of was shattered. Eventually the door creaked open and Grace stepped inside. Nina looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "How and why, Grace?" Nina croaked, her voice barely audible. "How did you get the videos and why would you do this to me today?" Grace hesitated, her expression conflicted. "I'm sorry, Nina," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. "I stumbled on the video while I was helping you arrange your baggage when you wanted to relocate and I couldn't stand by and let Daniel marry you without knowing the truth because I felt I should be the one walking down the aisle with Daniel and not you. Besides, Daniel deserved to know the truth." Nina shook her head, disbelief coursing through her. "The truth? You call this the truth? You stole the recordings just to destroy me and showed everyone my worst moments, Grace. You didn't show them the person I've become, the person I'm trying to be. How could you do this to me? I thought you were my friend." Grace looked away, guilt flickering across her face. "I was your friend, Nina. But do you know how hard it's been watching you get everything you want while I've been stuck in the background? You always get the attention, the love, the second chances. I guess I was jealous." Nina stared at her, the weight of Grace's words sinking in. Jealousy. That's what it had come down to. All this pain, all this destruction because of jealousy. "You've destroyed me," Nina whispered. "You've destroyed everything." Grace didn't respond. She simply turned and left, leaving Nina alone once again. At that moment Nina realized something. She couldn't keep running from her past. She couldn't keep hiding from her struggles, hoping they would go away. If she wanted to heal, if she wanted to build a life worth living, she had to face her demons head-on. Though her heart was shattered, a small spark of determination began to grow within her. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one she would write on her own terms. The days after the wedding felt like a blur to Nina, as if she were trapped in a dream she couldn't wake from. Except it wasn't a dream, it was her reality. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages and calls, some from well-meaning friends offering their sympathy, others from people wanting to pry into the scandal. Nina ignored them all. The only person she wanted to hear from was Daniel, but he remained silent. She stayed in her tiny apartment, curtains drawn, the world outside feeling as unreachable as the life she had once hoped to build. Her wedding dress hung limply in the corner, a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. She felt hollow, as though Grace's betrayal and Daniel's departure had carved a hole inside her that nothing could fill. At first she gave in to despair. She cried until there were no tears left, barely ate, and spent her days staring at the ceiling, lost in a fog of regret and shame. But as the days turned into weeks, something shifted within her. One morning, Nina woke up to find sunlight streaming through a gap in the curtains. With trembling hands she picked up her phone and called the therapist she had seen before meeting Daniel. The first few sessions were excruciating. Talking about her past wasn't just painful. It felt like peeling back layers of skin, exposing wounds she had worked so hard to cover. But her therapist, Dr. Patel, was patient and kind, guiding her through the memories and the emotions they stirred. "You've been carrying so much shame, Nina," Dr. Patel said during one session. "But shame is a heavy burden to bear alone. Healing starts when we learn to forgive ourselves." Forgive herself. The idea felt foreign to Nina. She had spent so long believing she didn't deserve forgiveness, that her mistakes defined her, that she wasn't worthy of love or happiness. But as the weeks passed she began to see herself differently. She wasn't just a collection of her worst moments. She was also someone who had tried, who had fallen and gotten back up, who was willing to fight for a better future. Outside of therapy, Nina began to rebuild her life piece by piece. She joined a support group for people dealing with compulsive relational behavior, where she met others who shared similar struggles. For the first time she didn't feel so alone. She found solace in their stories and strength in their resilience. She also threw herself into her hobbies, rediscovering the joy of painting and even trying pottery for the first time. The act of creating something with her hands, of shaping something beautiful out of raw materials, felt symbolic of the work she was doing on herself. One evening, after a particularly challenging therapy session, Nina sat down with a notebook and began to write. She wrote about her past, her struggles, her hopes, and her fears. She wrote about Grace and Daniel, about the pain they had caused and the lessons she had learned. The words spilled out of her like a flood, raw and unfiltered. When she finished, she felt a strange sense of relief. For so long she had carried her story inside her, letting it weigh her down. But now she was taking control of it. Months passed and Nina started to feel like herself again. No, not the person she had been before, but someone stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. She still thought about Daniel, of course. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if he regretted leaving, if he still cared. But she knew she couldn't base her healing on what-ifs. One day, while walking through the city, Nina passed by the cafe where she and Daniel had first met. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The memories hit her like a wave, but instead of drowning in them, she let them wash over her. She sat at the same table where they had shared their first conversation and ordered a cup of coffee. As she sipped her drink, she felt a sense of peace. She had come full circle, returning to the place where her journey with Daniel had begun. But this time she wasn't defined by their story. She was defined by her own. Back at home, Nina pulled out her notebook and flipped through the pages. She had written so much over the past few months, pouring her heart and soul onto the paper. As she read through her words, an idea began to form. What if she could use her story to help others? What if she could turn her pain into something meaningful? The thought filled her with a sense of purpose. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready to take the next step. Months turned into a year and Nina's life continued to evolve. She was no longer the woman who had been humiliated at her own wedding, nor was she the woman who had once hidden from her past. She had become someone stronger, someone who had embraced her flaws and turned them into stepping stones for growth. But there was one piece of her journey left unfinished: learning to forgive. Forgiving herself had been the hardest hurdle, but Nina had made progress. Forgiving Grace and Daniel, however, was a different story. Grace's betrayal still stung like a fresh wound, and Daniel's silence felt like a rejection she couldn't quite let go of. Every time she thought about them, a mix of anger and sadness bubbled up inside her. Holding on to resentment was like carrying a heavy backpack that only weighed her down. If she truly wanted to move forward, she needed to let it go. A week later, Nina found herself sitting in a small cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Across from her sat Grace, looking nervous and fidgety. Nina had reached out to her, asking to meet, and Grace had agreed, though her tone on the phone had been cautious. "I didn't think I'd ever hear from you again," Grace said, her voice hesitant. Nina took a deep breath. "I wasn't sure if I wanted to see you again," she admitted. "But I've had a lot of time to think and I realized that holding on to what happened isn't helping me. I need to understand why you did what you did. Not to excuse it, but so I can move on." Grace's shoulders sagged as if the weight of her guilt had been crushing her. "I don't know if I can give you a good reason," she said. "I was jealous, Nina. For so long I felt like I was living in your shadow. You always had this light about you even when things were falling apart. And when I saw you with Daniel so happy, I let my insecurities take over. I wanted to hurt you and I hate myself for it." Her voice cracked and she looked down at the table, unable to meet Nina's gaze. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to say it." Nina felt a pang of sadness as she looked at her former friend. Grace's actions had been cruel, but they had come from a place of pain and insecurity. Nina could see that now. "I won't lie, Grace," Nina said. "What you did hurt me more than I can put into words. But I also know what it's like to let your pain drive your choices. I'm working on forgiving myself and I think I can forgive you too. Not because what you did was okay, but because I don't want to carry this anger anymore." Grace's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long time, Nina felt a sense of peace. Forgiveness wasn't instant and it didn't erase the past, but it was a start. Letting go of the hurt with Grace was one thing, but Daniel was another. Nina still hadn't heard from him and she didn't know if she ever would. Part of her wanted to reach out to try and explain herself, but another part of her knew she couldn't force him to understand. But fate, as it often does, had its own plans. One afternoon, while browsing in a bookstore, Nina felt a familiar presence behind her. She turned and saw Daniel standing there holding a book in his hands. His eyes widened when he saw her, a mix of surprise and something else, relief maybe, flickering across his face. "Nina," he said softly. Her heart raced but she steadied herself. "Hi, Daniel." They stood there for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Daniel gestured toward a small cafe inside the store. "Do you have time to talk?" Nina hesitated but nodded. "I do." They found a quiet corner and Daniel took a deep breath. "I've wanted to reach out so many times," he began. "But I didn't know what to say. What happened at the wedding, it broke something in me and I didn't know how to process it." Nina nodded, her throat tight. "I understand. It broke me too. I reacted out of shock. I wasn't expecting to see a video of you with different men. I was devastated." Daniel continued. "But that doesn't excuse the fact that I walked away without giving you a chance to explain. I've regretted that every day since. I should have stayed. I should have listened." Nina swallowed hard. "I wanted to tell you everything, Daniel. I wanted you to know my past, but I was so scared you'd look at me differently. And then when Grace," her voice faltered. "It felt like my worst nightmare coming true." Daniel reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers. "I've thought a lot about what you must have felt that day. And I've thought about all the moments we shared before that. Nina, I fell in love with you for a reason. Not because you're perfect, but because you're strong and kind and real. I let my fear get in the way of that." Nina looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I've changed, Daniel. I've worked so hard to face my past and heal. But I'm not the same person I was a year ago." "I can see that," Daniel said. "And I'm proud of you. I don't expect us to go back to where we were, but if you're open to it, I'd like to start over. To get to know this new version of you." Nina's heart swelled with a mix of hope and caution. "I think I'd like that," she said. "But it has to be different this time. It has to be honest." Daniel nodded. "I wouldn't want it any other way." As they walked out of the bookstore together, Nina felt lighter. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time she wasn't afraid of it. She had faced her past, forgiven herself and others, and reclaimed her story. Whatever came next, she knew she could handle it. Her scars were still there, but they no longer felt like something to hide. They were a part of her journey, a testament to her resilience. And as she looked at Daniel, she realized that while her story wasn't perfect, it was hers, and that was enough. And so, Nina stepped into her future with a heart that was no longer burdened by shame or regret, but filled with courage, hope, and the promise of new beginnings.